The sound of his voice filled the room before I even understood what I had done wrong. It wasn't loud shouting, it was worse than that. Controlled, sharp, certain. The kind of voice that told you there was no room to explain, no space to ask questions, and no chance you would be heard. I remember standing there, still and small, staring at the floor because I already knew better than to look up. In that moment, my body learned something my mind didn't yet understand. When his voice changed, everything else stopped. Time slowed. Breathing became shallow. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. I wasn't afraid of being hurt. I was afraid of disappointing him, afraid of the silence that would come after, afraid of how quickly warmth could turn into distance. I can still see the room the way it looked that day. The light coming in through the window felt colder than usual. The air felt heavier. Nothing in the room had moved, yet everything felt different. His words were firm, measured, final. Each one landed and stayed there, long after he finished speaking. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself. I stood quietly and listened, the way I had been taught. That was part of growing up in our home. You listened, you accepted, you adjusted yourself so the rules could stay intact, even when you didn't understand them. What I didn't know then was that moments like that don't disappear. They settle somewhere deep. They shape how you see yourself, how you speak, how careful you become with your words and your feelings. At the time, it felt normal. Just another lesson, just another reminder of how things worked. Looking back now, that moment wasn't the worst one. It was just the clearest, the one that stayed with me, the one that quietly marked the beginning of a long silence I carried for years. I grew up in an American home where rules didn't need to be explained. They were simply there, like the walls or the ceiling. You didn't question them. You didn't ask why. You learned early that asking questions only created more trouble than it solved. Obedience was expected, not discussed. Our house was modest and tidy. Nothing fancy. Everything had its place. Shoes by the door, voices kept low, doors closed gently. Even laughter had a volume limit. There was a sense that order mattered more than comfort, and discipline mattered more than understanding. My father believed deeply in structure. He believed children needed guidance, boundaries, and firm correction to grow into responsible adults. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't careless, he was certain that strict discipline built character, certain that softness led to weakness, certain that rules kept families strong. My mother followed his lead, not because she didn't care, but because that was how things were done. She moved quietly through the house, keeping things running smoothly. Meals appeared on time, clothes were folded neatly, problems were handled privately, never discussed openly. Emotions were something you managed on your own. As a child, I learned to watch everything. I learned the sound of my father's footsteps and what they meant. I learned how the air felt when he walked into a room already irritated. I learned which topics were safe and which ones were better left alone. Most of all, I learned when to stay silent. Mornings were quiet, not peaceful, just controlled. We spoke when spoken to, we moved with purpose. There was no lingering at the table, no casual conversation. School, chores, dinner, bed. The routine was steady and predictable. Comfort came from knowing what was expected, even if it came with pressure. At school, I followed the rules just as carefully. Teachers liked me. I didn't cause trouble. I raised my hand. I did my work. Inside, though, I carried a constant sense of waiting to be corrected, waiting to be told I had done something wrong without realizing it. That feeling followed me everywhere, at home, at school, even with friends. I measured my words. I chose silence over risk. I learned that staying unnoticed was safer than standing out. Praise felt uncomfortable. Attention felt dangerous. There were no big talks about feelings in our house, no open discussions about fear or confusion. If something upset you, you dealt with it quietly. If something hurt, you kept it to yourself. Strength meant control. Control meant success. I remember sitting in my room at night listening to the house settle, the television clicking off, the sound of dishes being put away, the quiet footsteps in the hallway. That silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy. It reminded me that everything was being watched, even when no one was speaking. Rules governed the smallest details: how you sat, how you spoke, how you reacted. Mistakes weren't treated as learning moments, they were signs that you hadn't paid enough attention, that you hadn't tried hard enough to follow what had already been made clear. As a child, you don't question this. You assume it is normal. You assume every family works this way. You assume the tight feeling in your chest is just part of growing up. You assume love looks like correction, and approval comes only after perfect behavior. Over time, I became very good at reading the room. I could sense tension before a word was spoken. I could adjust myself to avoid conflict. I learned how to disappear emotionally while still doing everything right on the surface. Waiting became second nature. Waiting for permission, waiting for instruction, waiting for the right moment to speak, even though that moment rarely came. Listening mattered more than expressing. Observing mattered more than feeling. Looking back now, that environment shaped me in ways I didn't see at the time. It made me responsible. It made me careful. It also made me quiet in places where I should have felt safe. I didn't feel unloved. I felt managed, guided, corrected. And somewhere along the way, I learned that who I was inside mattered less than how well I followed the rules placed in front of me. That day when my father spoke to me with that firm, controlled anger wasn't unusual. It fit perfectly into the world I knew. What made it different was how still I felt, how something inside me shifted, even though I couldn't name it yet. That moment would become the one I carried forward, the one that everything else quietly grew out of. The moment didn't arrive with a crash or a sudden explosion. It came quietly, the way most important moments do. There was no warning bell, no clear signal that something lasting was about to happen. It started like many other days, ordinary on the surface, familiar in every detail. That's what made it so powerful. Nothing felt different until it was. I remember coming home that afternoon with a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. The house looked the same as always, same light through the window, same stillness in the hallway, but there was something in the air that felt tight, as if the walls themselves were waiting. I set my things down carefully, the way I always did, making sure nothing made noise. Noise drew attention. Attention often led to correction. My father was already home. I could tell by the sound of his chair moving slightly in the other room. He hadn't said anything yet, but I felt his presence immediately. It was like a weight settling into the house. You didn't need words to know when he was displeased. The silence itself carried meaning. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to speak or wait. Waiting usually felt safer. I stayed still, listening. The clock on the wall sounded louder than usual. Each second stretched longer than it should have. My heart beat faster, not from fear of being hurt, but from the fear of being seen as wrong. When he finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. That was never his way. His words were measured, controlled, and sharp. He asked a question I wasn't prepared for, something small, something that on another day might not have mattered at all, but that day it mattered. I tried to answer. My voice came out quieter than I expected. I stumbled over my words, not because I was lying, but because I didn't know what answer would be acceptable. He listened without interrupting, which somehow made it worse. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Then he spoke again, slowly, clearly. Each word landed with weight. He explained what I had done wrong, not angrily, but firmly. There was no space for disagreement, no room for explanation. He wasn't asking for my side of the story, he was delivering a judgment. As he spoke, I felt myself shrink inward. My shoulders tightened, my eyes dropped to the floor. I wasn't thinking about the mistake anymore. I was thinking about how completely powerless I felt in that moment, how small, how exposed. The room felt colder, even though nothing had changed. I noticed details that never mattered before. A crack in the wall, the way the light hit the edge of the table, my own hands clasped together trying not to move. My body knew what my mind hadn't caught up to yet. This was more than a correction. This was a line being drawn. He talked about responsibility, about expectations, about how rules existed for a reason. He reminded me that mistakes weren't acceptable, especially ones that showed a lack of attention or effort. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was final. There would be no discussion. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say I hadn't meant to disappoint him. I wanted to tell him I was trying. The words stayed stuck somewhere deep inside. I had learned long before that day that speaking up often made things worse. Silence was safer. When he finished, there was a pause. Not long, but long enough. Long enough for the weight of his words to settle. Long enough for me to feel something shift inside my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something quieter. A realization I didn't yet have words for. He told me to think about what I had done, to remember it, to do better next time. Then he turned away, the conversation over. Just like that. No hug, no reassurance, no sign that things were okay again. Just the expectation that I would absorb the lesson and move on. I stood there after he left the room, not sure what to do next. The house felt too quiet. The silence pressed in from all sides. I felt exposed, as if something inside me had been left uncovered. I didn't cry. Crying wouldn't have helped. I didn't feel angry. Anger didn't feel allowed. Instead, I felt hollow, like something had been removed without me noticing it happening. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing in particular. My mind replayed his words over and over, searching for a way to undo what had already been said. That was the moment everything changed, not because of what he said, but because of what I understood. I understood that my feelings didn't matter in moments like this, that intent didn't matter, that explanation didn't matter. Only obedience mattered. Only getting it right mattered. From that day on, I became more careful than ever. I checked and double-checked everything I did. I thought through every action before taking it. I avoided situations where I might make mistakes. The goal wasn't growth, it was safety. I didn't tell anyone about that moment. There was no reason to. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one would have seen it as significant. From the outside, it was just a parent correcting a child. Inside, though, something had closed off. I started to measure myself by how little trouble I caused. I took pride in being easy, in being quiet, in being reliable. Praise felt distant and rare, but avoiding disappointment became its own reward. At least I knew where I stood. That incident replayed in my mind for years. Not the words exactly, but the feeling, the stillness, the way the room seemed to shrink, the understanding that love, approval, and safety were conditional, earned through perfection, maintained through silence. As I grew older, similar moments happened again. Different situations, different words, same feeling. Each one reinforced the lesson I had learned that day. Don't question, don't explain, don't risk being wrong. At the time, I believed this was strength. I believed this was discipline. I believed this was how you became a good person. It never occurred to me that something important was being lost along the way. That day didn't break me, it shaped me, quietly, permanently, and I carried that shape into everything that came after. The defining moment wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't leave visible marks. It left something deeper, a silence that followed me long after the words themselves faded away, and that silence would only grow. After that day, nothing in the house looked different, but everything felt different.
The rules hadn't changed. The routine stayed the same. Meals were eaten at the same times, shoes were left in the same place, voices stayed low. From the outside, it would have looked like a calm, well-run home. Inside me, though, something had gone quiet. I didn't withdraw all at once. It happened slowly, in small pieces, almost gently. I spoke a little less each day. I laughed a little less freely. I stopped asking questions that didn't have clear answers. Curiosity felt risky. Wonder felt unnecessary. I learned to keep my thoughts tidy and hidden, the way I kept my room. Silence became a kind of protection. If I didn't speak, I couldn't say the wrong thing. If I didn't share, I couldn't disappoint. I watched others carefully and learned from their mistakes instead of my own. I noticed which actions earned approval and which brought correction. I adjusted myself accordingly, the way you adjust your posture without thinking about it. At school, teachers praised me for being well-behaved. I followed instructions exactly. I didn't cause trouble. I didn't draw attention. I did my work and handed it in neatly. Adults liked that about me. They saw responsibility. They saw maturity. They didn't see the tension in my shoulders or the way my stomach tightened when someone called my name unexpectedly. At home, I moved carefully through rooms, as if the house itself could hear me. I learned the sounds of doors, the rhythm of footsteps, the meaning behind small changes in tone. I could tell my father's mood without him saying a word. That awareness felt like a skill, something useful. It also kept me constantly alert. I stopped bringing problems to my parents. If something went wrong, I tried to fix it myself. If I felt confused or upset, I swallowed it. Feelings were unpredictable. They led to questions. Questions led to conversations I didn't want to have. It felt safer to handle things quietly, on my own. Friends noticed I was dependable. I listened more than I talked. I rarely argued. I went along with plans instead of suggesting my own. Inside, I often didn't know what I wanted anyway. Wanting things felt selfish. Having preferences felt dangerous. It was easier to agree. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Times when something felt unfair or confusing. I could feel the words rising, pressing against my chest. Then I would remember that quiet afternoon. The pause. The finality in my father's voice. The way the conversation ended without room for response. The words would sink back down. I learned to read faces instead of trusting my own feelings. I looked for approval in small signs. A nod, a brief comment, a lack of criticism. Those became measures of success. I rarely felt proud of myself, but I felt relieved when nothing went wrong. As the years passed, that silence settled deeper. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was distance, a space between what I felt and what I showed. I could function well, I could meet expectations, I could stay out of trouble. But connecting felt harder. Being open felt unfamiliar. Even joy came with caution. When something good happened, I waited for it to be taken away. When I felt excited, I tempered it. Strong emotions felt unsafe, even positive ones. Balance meant staying calm. Staying calm meant staying in control. My father didn't change much during those years. He remained steady, consistent, firm. He wasn't cruel. He provided. He worked hard. He believed deeply in discipline and structure. In his mind, he was preparing me for the world. I understood that even then. Understanding didn't make it easier. We spoke, but rarely about anything personal. Conversations stayed practical. Grades, chores, schedules. There was comfort in predictability, but also emptiness. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. I wasn't sure he wanted me to. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I did speak honestly. If I said I felt afraid, or unsure, or overwhelmed. The thought alone made my chest tighten. I had no proof that it would go badly, but experience told me not to risk it. So I kept quiet. I became very good at it. As a teenager, that quiet followed me into new spaces, new responsibilities, new expectations. I adapted quickly. I followed rules without questioning them. Authority felt familiar. I didn't rebel. I didn't push back. That earned me praise from some and confusion from others. Inside, I felt older than my age and younger at the same time. Old because I carried weight I couldn't name. Young because I hadn't learned how to speak for myself. Decisions felt heavy. Mistakes felt unbearable. Perfection felt necessary. There were nights when I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, checking for errors. I worried about things I hadn't said and things I might say in the future. Sleep came slowly. My mind stayed busy, even when the house was quiet. I didn't resent my father, not then. I believed this was normal. I believed this was how families worked. Other kids talked about being grounded or corrected. I assumed they felt the same way. I didn't know there were other ways to grow up. The silence didn't feel like a problem. It felt like a solution. It kept things smooth. It kept conflict away. It kept me safe. But it also kept me distant, from my parents, from my peers, from myself. I rarely asked for help, even when I needed it. I didn't want to appear weak. Weakness invited correction. Strength meant handling things quietly. I carried that belief with me everywhere. Over time, I stopped noticing the silence. It became part of me, like a habit you forget you learned. I thought this was just who I was, a calm person, a quiet person, someone who didn't need much. It wasn't until much later that I realized how much effort it took to maintain that calm, how much energy went into staying careful, how much of myself stayed hidden. Back then, I only knew that keeping quiet made life easier. It reduced friction. It met expectations. It worked. And so, the silence stayed. It followed me through childhood and into adulthood, shaping the way I spoke, the way I listened, the way I held myself. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It simply became the space where my voice might have been.
As an adult, it took me a long time to notice where that quiet came from. For years, I thought it was just my personality. I told myself I was reserved, thoughtful, low-key. Those words sounded respectable. They sounded chosen. It didn't occur to me that the quiet had been learned, practiced, and reinforced long before I had any say in it. Life moved on. I left home, I built a career, I formed relationships. From the outside, everything looked fine. I showed up on time, I did what was expected, I kept my life orderly. People trusted me. They saw someone steady, someone dependable. Inside, though, I still measured my words before speaking. I still waited for permission that no one had asked me to seek. When conflict appeared, my first instinct was to shrink, not engage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I complied, even when I disagreed, especially when I disagreed. It wasn't fear anymore. Not exactly. It was habit. Over time, I began to see patterns. In conversations, I listened well, but shared little. In relationships, I gave support easily, but asked for very little in return. When decisions needed to be made, I deferred. I assumed someone else knew better. Authority still felt heavier than it should have. Only later did I start to connect those dots, to that quiet afternoon, to the firm voice, to the feeling of being corrected without being understood. I realized that what stayed with me wasn't the discipline itself, it was the lesson underneath it. The lesson wasn't just about rules. It was about voice, about whose words mattered, about when it was acceptable to speak. My father believed deeply in discipline. He believed structure kept children safe. He believed order created strong adults. In many ways, he wasn't wrong. Discipline taught me responsibility. It taught me consistency. It taught me to finish what I started. But it also taught me to hide parts of myself, to trade honesty for approval, to stay quiet instead of curious. Those lessons were quieter, harder to see, but just as lasting. I don't blame my father. I understand him better now than I did then. He was raised in a different time, with different expectations. He did what he believed was right, what he had been taught, what the world had shown him. Understanding that doesn't erase the impact, it just gives it context. As the years passed, I started learning new skills, not the kind you put on a resume, the kind you practice slowly, awkwardly, saying what I feel, asking for help, disagreeing without apologizing, letting my voice exist in a room without shrinking it first. It didn't happen all at once. It still doesn't. Sometimes the old quiet returns. In tense moments, in unfamiliar situations, I feel it pulling me back toward silence, toward safety. But now I recognize it. I've learned that obedience can keep peace, but it can also cost connection. That discipline can build strength, but it can also build walls. And that silence, when chosen, can be powerful, but when learned through fear, it lingers in ways you don't expect. Looking back, I don't wish my childhood had been without rules. I don't wish discipline had been absent. I just wish there had been room for questions, for explanation, for understanding alongside correction. That space matters. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of moments you haven't thought about in years, you're not alone. Many of us grew up accepting things without question, carrying lessons we didn't realize we were still holding. If you feel comfortable, you might take a moment to reflect on your own childhood, on the rules you followed, the silence you learned, the parts of yourself you kept quiet. And if you'd like, you can share what stayed with you. Sometimes simply naming it is the first step toward understanding it differently.